A man is not a fool to give up what he cannot keep in order to gain what he cannot lose. These are the words from the late Jim Elliot I posted on my community board last night. There's two Protestant women who I greatly admire. I admire their faith. I think these are very strong women and great examples to every Christian. And that would be Corrie ten Boom and Elisabeth Elliot. Elisabeth Elliot was the wife of Jim Elliot. Jim was 28 years old when him and a group of missionaries felt called to go to Ecuador and minister and teach the gospel to a group of indigenous people called the Auca. The Aucas were known to be savage, vicious beasts. They were known to be very brutal, a very brutal tribe. So Jim Elliot and his team learned how to communicate with them. They flew, one of the guys knew how to fly a plane. They would fly gifts over. Then they built a camp nearby. One of the Indians one of the Aucas wandered into their camp, and they actually brought him for a plane ride. And the guy was amazed. Imagine these people are like never seen anything outside of the Amazon jungle. And they flew this guy on a plane. They gave him some gifts, and they were just about ready to head out there to evangelize these people when a group of 10 of them savagely and brutally came and killed them. They died for the cross. They were martyred for Christ. His wife, who came from a missionary family, parents were missionaries, actually missionaries to Catholics. They tried to get Catholics saved in Belgium. His wife, Elisabeth Elliot, felt called and I think led one other woman. I read the book Through the Gates of Splendor. She had written about this many years ago, maybe 30 years ago. So I believe it was one other woman of the martyred missionaries felt called to go back and forgive those Aucas. They were so angry and so hurt. I believe they had small children. Jim was 28 when he was killed. And they went back to minister to the Aucas. What bravery, what courage. And they converted the whole tribe, and they lived amongst the tribe for 2 years, teaching them the Bible, teaching them about Jesus. Has to be one of the bravest women on the planet. And so it was interesting. When I became Catholic, I was reading some Catholic newspaper or some website online, and this woman, I believe her name was Heidi Saxton, was a writer, and she was going to interview Elisabeth Elliot. So I thought this would be really interesting. And now Elizabeth was older now, much older, I think in her 80s. She recently passed away. But the interviewer, Heidi, was like me, an evangelical who converted to Catholicism, and her mom was still an evangelical. So her mom, her mom was in awe of Elisabeth Elliot. I mean, like all of us, she's a legend, in evangelical circles. Elisabeth Elliot is she's a legend. And so her mom was like so nervous. She's like, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe you're interviewing Elisabeth Elliot. Don't tell her what church you go to." So the Heidi said she was already nervous. Her mom made her more nervous. And Elizabeth asked her about her faith, and she told her she was Catholic. And she said, "Oh, you weren't always Catholic, were you? What made you switch?" And she said, "How do you know I wasn't always Catholic?" She said, "Well, I seen you used to work for Bethany Books, and they're definitely not a Catholic organization." And then she told her why she converted. And Elisabeth Elliot was very kind and said, "Oh, my brother, Thomas Howard," that was her maiden name, Howard. Thomas Howard became a Catholic. And she said, "Yeah, I know, I read his book." And Thomas Howard wrote a book called Evangelical is Not Enough. And he was a heavyweight. He wasn't a pastor, but he was a professor. I think he was like an English professor or something, but he was a very prominent evangelical. Him and Elizabeth came from a missionary family, and he knew as much as a lot of theologians. And he converted to Catholicism because he found evangelicalism wasn't enough. They just cut out so much of the truth. And he had a very popular book called Evangelical Isn't Enough. It's not enough. I have the book. I recommend it. And then Elizabeth Elliot said this. I wish I was brave enough. I wish I was as brave as my brother. And the girl was like confused. She goes, what do you mean? She goes, I wish I was brave enough to become Catholic. And it was startling to her, and it's startling to me, that this woman who was so courageous that she could go live amongst the savages that killed her husband and convert them because she had such great faith in Christ, was afraid to become Catholic because she knew the wrath that she would get from evangelicals, and she was afraid to become Catholic. And, I was on Keith Nestor's show a couple months ago. He interviewed me, and he told me that he was afraid to become Catholic. He knew it was the truth, but it took him 20 years. I guess it was easier for me because I was a blue-collar evangelical, and I'm a blue-collar Catholic, and I really don't care what people say about me. It's like, you want to fight? I'm like, make my day. It's always been my attitude. I'm always down for a good fight. But Keith was a pastor. He was an ordained Methodist pastor, but he also was hired by an Assemblies of God church because they needed a pastor. So he was he would preach in a Methodist church during the day and an Assemblies of God at night, a couple nights a week. So that was his profession. So he had a wife and kids, and he was giving up a lot. So a lot of these guys in ministry, it's very hard. Francis Beckwith. He's a biblical scholar, a Protestant scholar. He was the president of the Evangelical Theological Society, and he became Catholic while he was president. So he was giving up a lot: his reputation, his income, everything for the truth. And he knew he would have to step down as president, but he thought he could stay a member because there were some Eastern Orthodox members. And evangelicals back then were so anti-Catholic, and some of them still are, that they wouldn't let him even be a member. They threw him out. So not only couldn't he lead them, he couldn't even be part of their group anymore. So this is why a lot of evangelicals are afraid to become Catholic, because they've been propagandized their whole life to think Catholicism is evil, Catholicism is pagan, Catholicism is a false gospel. And then once they realize the truth, they're like, wow, no one's going to believe me. And a lot of them stay because they're afraid to be Catholic. But once you realize it's the church that Jesus Christ established, once you realize we're created to worship, and you understand what the supper of the Lamb actually is, and we can get a taste of it here on earth, and we can participate in the sacrifice of the Mass, true worship as they worship in heaven. When we realize what true worship is, you can't say no. You have to leave everything behind. You have to give up everything, pick up your cross, and follow Jesus to where he's calling you. So if you're a Protestant and you're thinking about Catholicism, don't be afraid. Many of us, it's a lot easier now than when Francis Beckwith and Dr. Scott Hahn and Steve Ray, people are becoming more biblically smart, and they're learning history, and they're not believing all these old myths that anti-Catholics like the KKK created in America, and the King of England over in Europe, in England, created all these lies about the Catholic Church. With technology, a lot of Protestants see the truth that we were the church that Jesus started, and they just debate our doctrines here and there. But there are still some very naive Protestants that think we have a false gospel, And there's ones that make a lot of money. John MacArthur has been bashing the church for years. He's about 80 years old, and he's worth $20 million. So it is profitable. There are professional anti-Catholics out there, and they're going to use their power of persuasion and authority to convince Protestants that the Catholic Church is wicked. But like I said, more and more Protestants are seeing the truth. That's why there's an evangelical exodus, and the Catholic Church is the only Christian church That's actually growing. From 2010 to 2020, we went from 1.2 billion members to 1.3 billion. Every other mainstream Protestant denomination is losing members. Southern Baptists are bleeding members for years. The Methodists, forget about it. I don't even know if they're going to make it. You know, there's thousands of churches leaving in every state. There's like over 1,000 in Florida alone that broke away from the Methodists. So, again, don't be afraid to be Catholic. God bless.